At a lonely desert rest stop in Red Mesa, a young woman lay bound in the back of a dusty silver SUV, sand on her cheeks, fear in her eyes, her wrists tied so tight the blood barely moved. Travelers walked past, laughing, scrolling, stretching, never noticing the danger hiding just steps away. Her captor had slipped off moments before, warning her what would happen if she dared make a sound. But Emily had one silent chance. She dragged the rope, once, twice, against the metal floor. A faint rasp. Then a tiny tap of her heel, a rhythm swallowed instantly by the desert wind. No human could hear it, but all 14 police dogs did. Heads snapped up, bodies stiffened, and without a single command, the K9 unit erupted into motion, charging straight toward the SUV. Something was terribly wrong, and only the dogs knew it. Before we begin, make sure to like and subscribe, and tell me, where are you watching from? Drop your country in the comments. Heat pressed down over the Red Mesa rest stop, turning the late afternoon air into a wavering sheet of glass and dust. Inside the dark, metal belly of the silver SUV, Emily Rhodes tried to remember how to breathe like a normal human being. Her back was pressed against the ridged floor, the heat of the desert seeping through the chassis into her spine, and her wrists burned where the coarse rope dug into her skin. She was 20, but in this moment she felt about 5, small, helpless, stripped of all the clever words and bright plans that used to fill her days at the University of Arizona. Normally, she was the kind of girl who smiled easily, with warm hazel eyes and a light dusting of freckles across a sun-kissed face from hiking trails and volunteering trips. Her dark brown hair, usually tied in a practical ponytail, was now tangled and stuck to her cheeks with sweat. Back on campus, people knew her as the girl who always signs up first. First for blood drives, first for tutoring, first for long, dusty drives to remote communities in New Mexico to pass out food and books. She believed the world was broken, but fixable, if enough people cared. Now, staring at the dull gray curve of the SUV's interior, she wasn't so sure. Her chest hitched, each breath catching halfway, like her lungs were refusing to draw in air from a world that had just betrayed her. Images flickered in her mind, out of order. The rest stop bathrooms, the vending machines humming, the smell of burnt coffee drifting from a small kiosk. A man's voice asking if she could help him with a map. She had glanced up, seeing a stranger with tired, sunburned skin, early 30s maybe, a man of medium height but wiry, with a lean, stringy build that suggested long days of manual work under a merciless sun. His jaw had been covered in patchy stubble, not quite a beard, just enough to shadow the sharp angles of his face. His hair, a muddy brown, stuck out from beneath the edge of a faded baseball cap, and his eyes, gray, restless, always scanning, never quite settled on her for long. The kind of man you might pity from a distance. Weather-beaten, clothes worn soft at the seams, an old brown jacket that had seen too many winters and too many truck stops. But there had been something else, too, in the way he smiled without warmth, in the way his gaze flicked past her to check who else was watching. A cold calculation that only made sense seconds before his hand had clamped over her mouth. Emily squeezed her eyes shut, fighting the memory of the rag's bitter chemical smell. He had carried her like she weighed nothing, shoved her into the back of the SUV, tied her wrists with quick, practiced motions. When she came fully around, he was leaning in close, his breath hot and sour, his gray eyes now steady and sharp. "You make one sound," he had whispered, voice low and even, "and I come back. You try to scream, I come back. You try to run, I come back. And I don't come back alone. Do you understand?" There had been history in that voice, years of not being listened to, a slow addiction to control, to making sure somebody finally had to obey him. Emily had nodded, terror clamping her throat like a physical hand. He'd smiled then, a thin, joyless curve of lips stretched over frustration and old resentment, and pulled the hatch down, shutting her inside. Now the world outside was a muffled blur of engines, footsteps, and the distant clang of a trash can lid. Through a thin gap between the rear seats and the side panel, a sliver of pale light cut through the gloom, throwing a narrow blade of brightness across her dust-smudged face. She swallowed hard. Her heart thudded against her ribs, faster and faster, as if it were trying to punch its way out of her chest. "Don't scream." The command echoed in her skull. Every instinct inside her howled to do the opposite, to draw in one huge breath and tear her throat raw on a single, shattering cry. But her body refused. Fear had settled like lead in her muscles, transmuting her will into paralysis. She could almost feel his hand still over her mouth, even though he was gone. I'm not safe. I'm not safe. I'm not safe. The thought pulsed through her mind, syncing with her heartbeat. Emily tried to anchor herself to something, anything, that wasn't terror. And then, from somewhere underneath the panic, a different memory rose. Early mornings back on campus, lacing up her running shoes, jogging around the track with her earbuds in. Not music, videos. Clips of K9 units, German shepherds leaping over walls, finding missing hikers, tracking suspects through forests. She liked the way the handlers spoke to the dogs, with trust, with respect, with something close to reverence. She'd watched a clip over and over of a handler explaining how dogs could pick up sounds and scents long before humans even realized something was wrong. They hear the danger you don't, the man in the video had said, his hand resting on his dog's back. They hear the heartbeat change. The breath change. They hear what you ignore. Emily's fingers twitched. She forced her gaze toward the sliver of light and tilted her head, straining to see outside. The angle hurt her neck, but slowly, the world beyond the metal frame came into view in thin, fragmented pieces. A blistered asphalt lot, 2 long-haul trucks, a scattered group of travelers standing near the vending machines, and just to the side of the main building, in a rectangle of shade cast by a metal awning, she saw them. 14 German shepherds lined up in a loose formation, some lying down, panting, tongues lolling, others sitting upright, their dark, intelligent eyes tracking the movements around them. Their coats ranged from sable to black and tan, each animal carrying a different pattern of saddle and mask, but all of them radiated a coiled, controlled power. They wore black harnesses stamped with white K9, lettering, thick collars, leashes looped loosely in the hands of their handlers. One of them caught her eye and held it. A large male, around 6 years old, with a rich sable coat streaked with darker hair along his spine and a faint pale scar across his muzzle, as if he had once broken through glass or metal and refused to stop. His eyes were a deep, molten amber, the kind of eyes that did not look at things, but into them. He lay with his front paws neatly aligned, body relaxed, but never slack. Every so often, his ears flicked, tracking sounds that didn't seem to exist. This was Max, the veteran of the unit, a dog who had spent years following scents through canyons and alleys, whose world was made of invisible threads humans would never feel. Standing beside Max was his handler, Ethan Hale. Ethan was in his mid-30s, tall and broad-shouldered, but not bulky, the kind of strength that came from long days on his feet rather than hours in a gym. His short, sandy brown hair was beginning to show the faintest hints of gray at the temples, a premature touch earned from too many late-night call-outs and too many scenes arriving just a little too late. His face was angular, with a straight nose and a jaw that clenched when he was thinking. A trimmed beard shaded his cheeks and chin, not fashionably perfect, just practical, concealing the tired hollows beneath his cheekbones. His eyes were a clear, steady blue, but there was a weight behind them that didn't come from age. Memories of kids found too late. Families he'd had to look in the eye and say, "I'm sorry" to. It had carved a quietness into him, a cautious way of moving through the world where he let the dog decide before he spoke. People who met Ethan casually thought he was calm, maybe a bit reserved. Those who worked with him knew he was a man who carried every failure like a stone in his pocket. Emily watched him absent-mindedly adjust Max's harness and say something she couldn't hear. Max's ears flicked. His tail gave one muted swish against the hot concrete. The rest stop felt suddenly closer, like the thin metal of the SUV had turned transparent, and if she could just push a little harder, someone would see her. They hear what you ignore. The line from the video returned, clear as if the handler were standing beside her. Her throat tightened. She still couldn't scream. Fear had hammered that door shut. But maybe she didn't have to be loud. Maybe she just had to be precise. Emily shifted her wrists, biting back a whimper as the rope tore at her skin. If she could drag the fibers across the metal floor, if she could scrape something, just enough to make a sound beneath the car noise and the wind, it felt ridiculous. It felt hopeless. But the alternative was to lie still and wait for the man in the brown jacket to come back and finish whatever he had planned. Slowly, she rolled one shoulder, tugging her arms down until the rope brushed the ridges in the metal. The first attempt produced nothing, just a dull pressure and a wave of nausea. She inhaled through her nose, counted to 3, and tried again, pressing harder. This time she heard it, a faint, brittle rasp, like sandpaper kissing steel. She froze, heart racing, then did it again. Rasp, rasp, rasp. Each stroke was a small act of rebellion against the panic clawing at her insides. "This is stupid," part of her whispered. "No one can hear that. You're just hurting yourself." Another part, the stubborn volunteer trip, sign up first part, answered silently. "Do it anyway." She added her heel, tapping the metal in the smallest rhythm she could manage, just enough to send a tremor through the vehicle's frame. Tap, 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 tap. A pattern, not random. A deliberate shape written in sound too small for human ears. Outside, from her narrow vantage point, the scene didn't change at first. Travelers still drifted past, oblivious, drinks in hand. The heat shimmered, the vending machine hummed on. Then Max's head snapped up. One moment, he was lying in the shade. The next, his ears were speared forward, his entire body turning into a taut line pointing toward the parking lot. His amber eyes sharpened, narrowing toward the row of vehicles like he had just heard his name whispered from a mile away. Emily's breath caught. Max rose to his feet in one smooth motion, muscles rippling under his coat. The other 13 dogs seemed to feel the shift roll off him like a shockwave. One by one, heads lifted, ears pricked, bodies stiffened until the entire line had transformed from resting pets into something ancient and alert. Ethan frowned, following Max's gaze. "What is it, buddy?" he murmured, scanning the lot. He saw nothing, just the same line of cars baking in the sun, the same tourists, the same dusty horizon. But Max knew. Without waiting for a command, he surged forward. The leash slid from Ethan's hand, and the other dogs burst into motion behind him, paws hammering the asphalt, claws scraping as they launched into a full sprint. "Max, heel!" Ethan barked, instinct pulling the word from his throat, but even as he said it, a part of him held back. Max was not reckless. Max did not break formation unless something inside his chest demanded it. Travelers jerked out of the way with startled cries as 14 German shepherds tore across the lot like a living storm. A man holding a soda stumbled, the cup flying from his grasp. A woman grabbed her child and yanked him behind a bench, eyes wide. Someone shouted, "What's going on with the dogs?" The air filled with the thunder of paws and the sharp electric energy of imminent collision. Emily heard it long before she saw it. The SUV trembled faintly under the pounding of a dozen bodies rushing closer. Panic flared. Is he back? Is he running toward me? Then twisted into something dizzy and impossible as she saw, through the narrow gap, the blur of black and tan bodies, streaming straight toward her prison. Max hit the side of the SUV first, skidding to a stop with a heavy thud, his claws screeching against the metal. He leapt, front paws landing on the bumper, then vaulted smoothly onto the rear hatch, nose working furiously. The others fanned out, circling the vehicle in a tight, whirling ring, their chests heaving, low growls rumbling just beneath the surface like distant thunder. To anyone who didn't understand, it might have looked like they were about to attack the car, but their eyes told a different story. They weren't looking for something to bite. They were looking for someone to save. Emily flinched back as Max's weight shifted above her, then froze when his snout pressed close to the seam of the hatch. A deep, vibrating sound rolled through the metal around her, not a threat, but a declaration. "I know you're there." A voice outside, close now, ragged with surprise and adrenaline. "What the hell? Max!" The hatch jerked, then lifted, flooding the compartment with blinding light and a rush of hot air. Emily blinked against the brightness, vision swimming. When her eyes finally focused, she saw Ethan Hale framed against the desert glare, his blue eyes going wide as they took in her bound wrists, her bruised face, the raw fear carved into every line of her posture. For half a second, the world narrowed down to just the two of them. His hand went to the knife at his belt, fingers closing around the handle. He moved slowly, carefully, not wanting to spook her, his voice dropping to a gentleness that felt almost unreal in the harsh air. "Hey," he murmured. "You're okay. You're safe now. I'm going to cut you loose, all right?" He began to lean in, and that was when Max changed. The big shepherd, who had been poised with his head lowered toward Emily, suddenly stiffened. His ears whipped backward, then forward again, his whole body pivoting as if dragged by an unseen rope. A growl rolled out of his chest, low and dark, aimed not at the girl, but at the horizon beyond the rest stop. Dust swirled in a sudden gust, spiraling up from the edges of the lot like something had breathed on the desert. The air grew heavy, thick with a tension Emily could feel on her skin. The tiny hairs on her arms rose. The memory of that gray-eyed man's whisper curled like smoke through her mind. "I come back." Her voice finally emerged, thin and cracked, but sharp with a certainty that made Ethan's hand freeze on the knife. Her eyes locked on the empty, shimmering stretch of sand behind the gas station, and her lips trembled as she forced the words out. He hasn't gone anywhere," Emily whispered. "He's still here." The late afternoon heat clung to the desert like a living thing, smothering every breath in a blanket of shimmering dust as Officer Ethan Hale moved away from the SUV, one hand resting on Max's harness. The other handlers were spreading out already, forming a loose but disciplined perimeter around the vehicle, weapons holstered but hands hovering above the grips. Emily Rhodes sat on the edge of the SUV's cargo opening now, still trembling, still dehydrated, still staring into nothing, as though her mind hadn't fully accepted that she'd been found. Her hair, dark brown and tangled, framed her pale, sun-blotched face like a broken halo. Even with her wrists free, her arms remained rigid against her chest, locked in a posture of self-protection her body refused to let go of. The team included several handlers besides Ethan. Closest to him was Officer Daniel Ruiz, a broad-shouldered man in his mid-20s with warm brown skin, a short fade haircut, and the kind of nervous energy that made him tap his thigh unconsciously even when he stood still. He was new to the division, eager but intensely empathetic, sometimes too much so for K-9 work. Ethan had seen him go quiet for days after a search that didn't end well. Behind Daniel was Officer Grace Maddox, a tall, lean woman in her 40s, with steel gray hair chopped short in a no-nonsense cut. She had the hardened calm of someone who had spent half her life in law enforcement and lost more partners, human and canine, than she cared to count. Her expression was nearly always flat, but her eyes were sharp and alert, missing nothing. The other handlers fanned out with their dogs, forming two groups just as Ethan directed. One group to stay near Emily and secure the immediate area, and the other to follow Max's instincts into the desert. Emily's gaze tracked Ethan as he approached, and though her expression barely changed, fear flickered in her eyes like a candle too close to the wind. "We're going to look around," Ethan told her gently, keeping his voice steady, grounded. "You're safe here. These officers will stay with you." She nodded, but her hands remained clenched in tight fists, knuckles white. Whatever she had endured, it had dug deep inside her and left splinters that would not leave easily. Max pressed his shoulder against Ethan's thigh, urging him forward. The dog's amber eyes were locked not on Emily now, but on the open stretch of desert behind the rest stop, the same direction he had reacted to minutes earlier. Ethan signaled to the second team. "We sweep east first," he instructed. "Footprints, tire marks, dropped fabric, anything." Grace lifted a brow. "You think he's still close?" Ethan didn't answer. Max answered for him. The German shepherd emitted a low, determined woof and began pulling forward, nose skimming the wind. The search team followed Max into the desert's edge where the asphalt bled into shifting dunes. The air was dry, enough to crack lips and sting eyes. Even seasoned officers felt the heat lancing through their boots. Max slowed as they reached the sand, lowering his muzzle until it nearly touched the ground. Ethan watched him carefully. He trusted the dog more than he trusted most human instincts, including his own. Max moved in a zigzag pattern at first, like he was lining up invisible puzzle pieces. Then his body stiffened, and he pulled sharply to the right. "He's got something," Ethan called back. The group tightened up. Daniel jogged closer, wiping sweat from his forehead. "What is it? Footprints?" Ethan scanned the ground. At first he saw nothing but sand. Then Max's movements revealed it, half-buried impressions pressed deep into the earth. A man's boot, Ethan muttered. Heavy tread, size, 12, maybe. Grace knelt beside it, her experienced eyes narrowing. Not old, she said. Hours at most. Max pulled forward again. They followed. Soon they reached a patch of jagged stone partially shaded by a boulder. There, caught on the sharp edge of a rock, was a strip of torn brown fabric. Ethan's stomach tightened. From his jacket, he whispered. Emily had described it perfectly. Brown, worn, frayed at the cuffs. Daniel reached out with gloved fingers and lifted the piece delicately. He tore it here, he said, probably snagged while carrying something. Grace stood slowly, her gaze sweeping the sand around them. Within seconds, she froze. Look. Ethan followed her stare. The sand bore long, uneven drag marks, faint but unmistakable. Marks that spoke not of luggage or supplies, but of something with weight, something unwilling. Ethan's mouth went dry. He's done this before, Grace said quietly. More than once. Daniel's throat bobbed. He dragged someone? Or something, Ethan said darkly, though his gut told him exactly what. Max growled, a low guttural sound that vibrated through the soles of Ethan's boots. The dog was staring beyond the drag marks, toward a cluster of boulders, stacked like broken teeth rising from the desert floor. Ethan motioned the team forward. The heat radiating off the rocks made the air warp and shimmer, distorting distance and shape. Max's paws scraped across compacted sand as he approached the largest boulder. He lowered his head again, sniffing deeply, then suddenly jerked his gaze upward toward the stone itself. Ethan stepped closer and saw it. Carved into the vertical face of the rock, deep and jagged, was a symbol. R27. Each stroke was cut with pressure, as though someone had taken a knife and carved it in a hurry, but with forceful intention. Daniel breathed out shakily. What the hell is that? A code? Grace shook her head. I've seen gang marks, cartel signs, trafficker symbols. That's not one of them. It's his, Ethan said quietly. It has to be. Max suddenly erupted into a sharp, furious bark. One bark, then another, each louder than the last, his hackles rising along his spine until his fur stood like bristles. The other dogs in the search team joined in moments later, a cacophony of alarm rolling across the desert like a siren made of teeth and instinct. Ethan felt a cold ripple through the heat, an invisible finger tracing the back of his neck. His voice dropped to a whisper, barely audible above the barking. He was just here. And Max, growling, eyes burning with recognition, did not look away from the empty stretch of desert where the heat shimmered like a mirage hiding something that had only moments earlier been alive and watching. The temporary medical tent stood at the edge of the Red Mesa rest stop, its canvas walls fluttering weakly in the desert wind, as if the structure itself were trying to breathe through the heat. Inside, the air was cooler thanks to a portable generator powering a single humming fan, but even that faint breeze felt fragile, too soft, too temporary for the weight of what Emily Rhodes carried inside her chest. She sat on a metal folding chair, her posture curled inward, shoulders tight and drawn, as though she feared her own shadow might reach for her. Her wrists were now bandaged with clean white gauze, but she stared at them as if the rope burns were still there. A paramedic stood nearby, a woman named Nora Briggs, who appeared to be in her mid-30s. Nora had the sturdy, capable build of someone used to lifting stretchers and injured hikers, with sandy blonde hair pulled back into a messy bun and sunburned freckles scattered across her tanned skin. She had warm hazel eyes, the kind that made people talk even when they didn't want to, and her personality radiated professional calm mixed with a quiet maternal instinct. She had seen trauma before. She knew its look, its voice, and its silence, and Emily was wrapped in all three. Nora gently checked Emily's pulse again, her movements slow and deliberate. Your heart rate's still a little high, she said softly. Try taking small breaths, in through your nose, out through your mouth. Emily tried. The breath shuddered halfway out of her, catching on something brittle lodged deep inside her lungs. A tremor rippled through her fingers. Her throat felt thick, as if held shut by invisible hands. Daniel Ruiz stood just outside the tent flap, arms crossed, trying not to hover while failing miserably. He watched every twitch of Emily's posture with wide, empathetic eyes. Daniel, despite his strong build, carried a softness that didn't quite fit in law enforcement. A softness shaped by a childhood where he often played interpreter for frightened relatives, always learning to soothe others before himself. Trauma clung to him even when it wasn't his own. Every time Emily flinched, Daniel's jaw tightened the way it did when he wanted to protect someone and didn't know how. Ethan Hale was different. He stood behind Emily's chair, feet planted, hands resting calmly on his belt. His face was marked by the same quiet stillness he always wore, but Emily sensed something underneath. An attentive readiness, as if he were absorbing her fear and converting it into focus. Max sat, pressed against Ethan's leg, his thick sable coat brushing the officer's khaki pants. The German shepherd was still alert, ears flicking occasionally toward the tent entrance, but his eyes remained fixed on Emily with a strange, patient sympathy. His body language spoke, "You're not alone." Emily's voice had not returned fully. It emerged in halting whispers, pieces of sentences that died halfway through her lips. Nora crouched to adjust the bandage on her wrist. "Emily," she murmured, "you're safe now. No one here is going to hurt you, but we need to understand what happened, okay? Just whatever you remember." Emily swallowed, her throat working like she was trying to push broken glass downward. Her mind felt like it had been shaken, its pieces scattered, but certain sounds, certain fragments, remained sharp. She stared at the floor long enough that Ethan wondered if she'd speak at all. Then she finally said, He wasn't alone." Daniel stepped closer. "What do you mean, not alone? Did you see someone else?" Emily shook her head quickly, too quickly, eyes widening in reflexive panic. "No, I didn't see anyone else, but—" Her breath trembled. "He made a phone call, right before he tied my wrists. I pretended to be unconscious, so he didn't know I heard him." Ethan exchanged a glance with Nora. The paramedic nodded for him to gently continue. "Do you remember what he said?" Ethan asked, voice low, steady. Emily pressed her palms together so tightly the knuckles blanched. "Yes, some of it." She inhaled shakily, her voice thinning to a trembling thread. "He said something like, 'We're close to the third drop point.' Then he said, 'The handlers won't wait forever.'" Daniel frowned. "Handlers?" Grace, who had entered silently moments earlier, let out a breath through her nose. "Not a term I've heard in trafficking cases." "No," Ethan murmured, "but he said it like it was a group." Emily nodded, her eyes darting to Ethan's face, searching for something. Recognition, understanding, safety. "He also said, R27. Her voice cracked. "That was the part he whispered, like it was important." Max whined softly. Ethan ran his fingers through the dog's fur in a slow, grounding stroke, his mind turning over the information like a puzzle piece that didn't quite fit yet, but felt eerily familiar. "Emily," Ethan said carefully, "was he talking about you when he made that call?" Her lips trembled. Her eyes fell to the bandages on her wrists. "No," she whispered. "That's the worst part." Nora leaned in, her voice barely a murmur. "What do you mean?" Emily's shoulders folded inward, as if she were trying to make herself small enough to disappear. "He said I wasn't the one they wanted. He said I was just—" Tears welled. "Just a temporary replacement." The words hit the tent like a physical blow. Daniel's face drained of color. Grace's jaw tightened until the muscle twitched. Ethan stilled, his breath freezing inside his chest. Temporary. Meaning there was another girl, another target, or something far worse, a plan, a system, a chain that Emily had been dragged into by accident. Ethan's thoughts skipped backward, months earlier, to reports that still haunted him. Missing person cases near the Arizona-Nevada line, young women disappearing without signs of struggle, without clues, without patterns obvious enough for the department to piece together. Cases that felt wrong but never connected, until now, until Emily. It slotted together like a lock clicking into place. His throat tightened, not with fear, but with a heavy, dangerous certainty. Daniel broke the silence first. "Ethan, you think this is connected to those disappearances?" Ethan didn't answer immediately. He stared down at Max, who looked back at him with the same tense stillness. Then he looked at Emily. "Yes," he said quietly. I do. And Emily, staring at him with wide, wet eyes, realized the truth before he spoke the next sentence. This wasn't random. Night slid over Red Mesa like a slow, black curtain, swallowing the last traces of orange daylight until the desert turned into a vast, breathing thing made of shadows and heat trapped inside the rocks. Ethan Hale stood near the edge of the rest stop's parking lot, boots planted firmly in the dust, one hand resting on Max's harness as the German Shepherd sat alert beside him. The dog's sable coat glowed faintly under the flickering yellow security lights, and his amber eyes reflected the darkness like molten metal. Max was tense, not afraid, not restless, but ready, the way only a seasoned K9 became before the world tilted into danger. Ethan could feel the dog's heartbeat through the harness strap, steady but elevated, like a war drum muffled under skin. Ethan's own pulse matched it. He had felt this sensation before, during late-night manhunts, during searches for missing hikers, during calls that ended with too many sirens and not enough survivors. His body recognized it even before his mind did, the moment between calm and chaos, held together by a thin thread of silence. Behind him, the rest of the K9 unit spread out across the dark lot. Daniel Ruiz stood near a row of vending machines, his broad frame outlined in the dim light. The young officer's face was paler than usual, his nervous habit of tapping fingers now replaced by a rigid stillness. He was scared. That much was obvious, but he also carried a look Ethan recognized, the determination of someone who refused to let fear decide the outcome. Grace Maddox moved like a shadow near the fuel pumps, tall and lean, her sharp gray eyes scanning the horizon with the calm calculation of a woman who had lived through too many close calls. Her jaw was tight, her stance angled slightly forward, ready to intercept danger before it reached anyone else. Even in silence, she embodied the hardened resilience of someone who had already survived more than the desert could throw at her. A few additional officers had arrived to reinforce the team, including Sergeant Paul Kemper, a thick-set man in his late 40s with a squared jaw, a salt and pepper buzz cut, and deep lines carved around his eyes. His skin was weathered from decades of Arizona sun, and his forearms bore scars from a long career handling violent arrests. Kemper was known among the force for being blunt, sometimes harsh, but fiercely protective of junior officers. Tonight, even he was unusually quiet, jaw clenched around a tension he didn't bother to hide. The radio clipped to his vest crackled sharply, breaking the silence. A dispatcher's voice, thin from poor signal, cut through the air. Unit 7, be advised. Black pickup truck, no plates. Headed your direction from the westbound service road. Speed estimated above 90. Everyone stiffened. Ethan's stomach tightened like a fist. Daniel whispered, "It's him. It has to be him." Grace didn't answer. She didn't need to. The desert seemed to hold its breath. In the distance, engines hummed faintly. At first the sound was small, like a mosquito's whine lost in the wind. But then it grew, louder, deeper, biting into the stillness with the unmistakable snarl of a pickup pushed too hard through loose sand. Max's ears shot upward. The dog's body leaned forward, nose lifted into the dark. Then a low rumble escaped his chest. Recognition, fury, warning. Ethan felt it vibrate through his leg. "He smells him," Ethan said quietly. "It's the same man." Grace moved closer. "Positions!" The unit split into flanking lines. The dogs kept low and silent. Spotlights were switched off to avoid giving away their locations. Even the vending machines seemed to go quiet. The air thickened. Then the black pickup burst into view, dust exploding behind it like a tail of smoke. The vehicle swerved violently as it tore down the narrow access road, headlights bouncing erratically over the cracked asphalt. Ethan saw the driver silhouetted through the windshield, a lean figure jerking the wheel with reckless confidence. His mind flashed back to Emily's voice trembling in the medical tent. "He's not alone. He said I was a replacement." The truck screeched into the parking lot so hard the tires briefly left the ground. It slammed down with a metallic thud, skidding sideways. Grace yelled, "Hold positions!" But Max didn't need the order. He was already coiled like a drawn bow, ready to launch. The truck shuddered to a stop. For one heartbeat, everything froze. Then the driver's door swung open. He stepped out. The same man. The same brown jacket, torn at the sleeve where the fabric had snagged earlier. His face was gaunt and sharp, all angles and shadow, with cheeks slightly sunken and a scruffy beard framing a jaw that seemed locked in permanent tension. His eyes, those cold, restless gray eyes, swept the lot with an intensity that bordered on feral. His posture was loose, but deceptive, like a coil ready to spring. He exuded a sense of someone who had lived too long outside the rules of other people, someone shaped by years of bitterness and a hunger for control. Max's growl tore through the air. The man froze when he saw the dogs, but not with fear, more like annoyance, as if their presence was an inconvenience rather than a threat. Ethan stepped forward, weapon drawn but angled down. "Hands where we can see them." The man didn't comply. Instead, he smirked, a chilling, deliberate gesture. "You're too late," he said, voice hoarse but smug. "You're playing catch-up, officer." His words slithered through the dark, carrying an arrogance that only hardened Ethan's resolve. Kemper moved toward the passenger door, keeping low. Daniel circled wide to cover the rear of the truck. Grace advanced with 2 dogs at her side, steps controlled, breath steady. Ethan gestured, "Open the truck." Kemper yanked the rear door. It swung wide. What waited inside made Ethan's skin crawl. Maps, dozens of them. Some folded, some torn, some covered in dirt, all marked. Dozens of red X's, circles, and short codes scribbled in black marker, and several of them, too many, labeled R27. Under the maps were photographs, grainy, blurred, taken from a distance. Faces of young women, some frightened, some unaware. All potential victims. Daniel whispered, voice cracking, "Oh God, this wasn't just about Emily." Ethan stared at the maps, horror rising cold and fast in his chest. "No," he murmured. "This is a system. A chain." Grace lifted one photo with gloved hands, her face turning hard as stone. "This isn't one kidnapper," she said. "This is an operation." Behind them, Max's growl deepened, vibrating through the night like a warning the world had ignored for too long. The sun rose over the Colorado Plateau like a slow-burning ember, bleeding orange across an endless sweep of stone and sand. Ethan Hale stood at the edge of a dry ravine, boots sinking into red dust as he surveyed the barren stretch before him. The desert was quiet, too quiet, its silence the kind that swallowed even a whisper. Max stood beside him, the German shepherd's sable coat bristling lightly as he sniffed the air. At 6 years old, Max carried the rugged strength of a seasoned K9, broad chest, scar across his left flank from a run-in with a smuggler 2 years earlier, and amber eyes that tracked danger with uncanny precision. Behind them, the K9 unit worked in near-silent coordination. Grace Maddox adjusted her tactical vest, her lean figure cutting a sharp silhouette against the rising sun. Daniel Ruiz tightened the straps on his gloves, jaw clenched, dark brows knitting with nervous determination. And just a few steps away stood Lieutenant Owen Mercer, the newest officer called to assist. Mercer was in his early 40s, tall and wiry, with salt and black hair swept back and a faded undercut. His angular face was marked by deep stress lines, especially around the mouth, scars from years navigating cartel corridors and losing more informants than he cared to admit. His gray eyes held a relentless, simmering focus, the kind found only in men who had paid heavy emotional taxes to stay in this job. Mercer rarely smiled, rarely raised his voice, and seemed carved from the same stone as the desert itself. "Satellite shows heat signatures under the ridge," Mercer said quietly. His voice was gravel, rough, from too many late-night coffees and unfiltered desert air. "Something's down there." Ethan nodded once. "Emily said they used the phrase transit point." He paused. She wasn't wrong. Emily Rhodes stood a few feet behind him, tucked in a borrowed tactical jacket that hung too big on her thin shoulders. Her dark hair, now washed and pulled back into a loose ponytail, framed a face still bruised but filled with a fierce, unmistakable resolve. She wasn't the terrified girl in the SUV anymore. Something had hardened inside her, some inner fire that trauma sometimes leaves behind in the rare few who refuse to break. But the closer they moved to the ridge, the tenser her breathing became. Her fingers shook, curling into the fabric of the jacket like she was anchoring herself to the present each time the past threatened to drag her back. "I remember this landscape," she whispered, voice unsteady. "It feels like where he drove after After he tied me. Ethan's jaw tightened. He wanted to shield her from every dark corner of this place, yet he knew she was the key to understanding the full picture. Stay close, he murmured. No one goes ahead of Max. Max let out a low woof, as if promising her personally. They descended the ridge in tight formation, the dry wind scraping across their faces. The sand bore faint tire tracks, old, almost erased, but unmistakably similar to the tracks at Red Mesa. Max followed them with the silent confidence of a seasoned hunter. His nose dipped, body lowered, tail stiffened. Something was here, something hidden. The desert floor shifted slightly beneath their boots. Daniel paused. Ethan, look. A square of metal jutted from the earth, half buried, rusted at the edges. At first glance, it looked like debris, until Max's bark sliced through the stillness. The team converged. Ethan knelt, brushing dust off the object. A metal latch, then the faint outline of a door. It's a container, Grace said, voice tightening. Underground. Mercer's breath dragged slowly through his teeth. They buried it to avoid drones. Ethan and Mercer pulled the hatch upward. The metal groaned, resisting like something alive. Then it snapped open. A stale breath of cold, recycled air gushed out. Flashlights flicked on. The ladder led into a steel room lit by a flickering emergency bulb. Ethan descended first, boots clanging on metal rungs. What he saw froze him. There were bunk beds, small, narrow, neatly arranged. Cup hooks with clothing too youthful, too fragile. A shelf lined with water bottles, some half full. A camera mounted in the corner, red light dead now but undeniably used. Makeup kits, hair ties, a bracelet shaped like a butterfly. Ethan swallowed hard. God, there were girls here. Emily appeared at the hatch, light trembling in her hand. Ethan held up a cautioning palm, but she shook her head and stepped inside anyway. Her breath caught. The beds, the brushes, the bracelets. She walked slowly, fingers grazing the cold wall, eyes widening with dawning horror. He wasn't lying, she whispered. I wasn't the first. Grace found a small notebook wedged under a mattress, pages torn, smudged, filled with coded lists and initials. On the last page, just one sentence. Ethan read aloud, voice tightening around the words. Next transfer, 48 hours. Emily's hand shot out, gripping Ethan's sleeve. 48 hours, she said, voice breaking and strengthening at the same time. Ethan, they're still alive. Somewhere out there. We have to save them. Ethan looked at her, really looked. Beneath the fear and trauma was steel, fire, purpose. Max pressed his muzzle gently against Emily's hand, sealing her plea without words. Ethan exhaled, long and heavy. We will, he said. All of them. The desert wind moaned through the open hatch as if the land itself understood the promise they had just made, and the storm that was coming. The desert swallowed their footsteps as the team climbed out of the buried container, leaving behind the cold echo of a truth they could no longer escape. Above them, the sky stretched wide and burning, as if the land itself knew time was running out. 48 hours. That was all they had. 48 hours before the next transport, before more girls vanished into the shadows of the plateau. Emily stood between Ethan and Max, her fingers trembling, but her gaze unbroken. For the first time since her rescue, there was fire in her eyes, fear and courage woven together like two parts of the same heartbeat. Max nudged her hand once more, sealing a promise none of them dared speak aloud. They would go after them. They would find the others. And they would bring this monstrous operation to its knees. But out there, somewhere across the endless ocean of stone and heat, someone was already moving the pieces, watching, waiting, preparing for the next phase. And this time, the hunters were about to become the hunted. If you want to see what happens next, don't forget to like, share, and hit subscribe. Part 2 is coming. And the truth buried beneath this desert is only just beginning to rise. Tell us in the comments, do you think they'll make it in time?